The hallway of the SEAL Bravo Training Center lived its own restless life. Boots slammed against the floor in heavy waves. Metal lockers banged like they were arguing. A faint mix of machine oil and sea salt hung in the air. Emily Ward walked through that storm quietly. A stack of briefings in her hands, checked 3 times. Light gray cardigan, simple navy blouse. Hair pinned back neatly. Nothing about her demanded attention. But attention always found her. Just not the kind she deserved. "Look, the librarian's back," one candidate muttered, nudging his buddy. "Hope she brought us new coloring books," another whispered with a smirk. They spoke just loud enough to make sure she heard. Emily tightened her grip on the folders. But her pace never changed. Near the briefing room door stood Lieutenant Harris. Perfect uniform. Perfect posture. Perfect smug smile. The same one she'd seen 100 times. "Miss Ward," he drawled, "here to alphabetize our shelves today." Laughter echoed behind him. Emily simply nodded. No comeback. No irritation. She walked past him like moving through smoke and closed the door behind her. Silence swallowed the hallway. Even the ones who laughed shifted uncomfortably. Her official title was painfully boring: Administrative Librarian Archivist, Bravo Training Unit. In reality, it meant every scrap of paper on that base eventually passed through her hands. Mission logs, maps, shadow files, technical manuals, schedules. Her office was wedged between the operations wing and an old warehouse. Most people walked by without even noticing the door, but Emily noticed everyone. She moved with the precision of someone trained to remove errors the way others remove threats. Her gestures were small, exact, and never wasted. Her voice, calm, even quiet, yet without a drop of insecurity. Every morning she came earlier than sunrise, when the base still slept under the weight of gray ocean air. She unlocked the library, switched on the warm overhead light, and sorted through the piles of documents the night shift left somewhere in the corner. She corrected dates, checked coordinates, taped torn pages, transferred corrections into digital catalogs. In the margins, she left tiny pencil marks, so subtle they were barely visible. Instructors trusted those marks more than their own notes, though none would ever admit it. Outside the library, the world was louder. Candidates hurried past, weighed down by gear and youthful arrogance. Some nodded, most didn't. To them, she was an outsider. No bruises, no mud, no scars. When she entered a room with training folders, conversations dipped just enough to let her know she wasn't welcome. When she left, doors slammed harder than physics required. One petty officer, stuck at the same rank for years, once muttered loudly enough for her to hear, "Must be nice. Safest job on base. No bullets, no night ops, no danger." He smiled, but jealousy rattled in his voice. Emily handed him the file, nodded, and walked away. Another day, a candidate sprinting down the hall slammed into her shoulder so hard the folders nearly spilled. He didn't stop, didn't apologize, just kept running like he'd bumped into a piece of furniture, not a human being. Still, she worked silently, prepared historical packets for new recruits, straightened flags and nameplates in the memorial hall, checked that not a single veteran's surname was misspelled. At lunch, she sat alone. Not because she was pushed away, but because every table held loud stories about broken ribs, insane drills, and heroic, almost happened moments. Emily didn't mind. She used that hour to read old mission journals, the ones handwritten, the ones no longer discussed publicly. She touched their yellowed pages the way others touch family photographs. And there were other details. Details that didn't fit the image of a quiet civilian librarian. Her posture, too straight, too military. Her eyes, always identifying exits, blind spots, and cover points. In every room, she instantly marked where the nearest first aid kit was and where the secondary exit led. On veteran days, she never stepped forward to greet visitors. She stayed behind the shelves, watching them, and on her face appeared a strange expression, a mix of respect and distance, as if she were connected to them, yet forbidden to show it. Sometimes someone noticed. A young technician once asked her about a mechanical detail in an old manual. Emily answered too quickly, too confidently, like someone who'd used that equipment in the field, not read about it in a book. He left, confused, glancing back at her again and again. But the base didn't like questions. New drills replaced old doubts. Emily blended back into the background noise. That afternoon, the briefing hall was packed. Candidates, still dripping after the obstacle course, filled the seats, joking loudly. Captain Rhodes prepared his navigation presentation, tapping the projector remote nervously. Emily entered quietly and began placing folders in front of each recruit. When she reached candidate Briggs, her eyes flicked over the top page. A map. One coordinate was wrong. A tiny number, but enough to throw off tomorrow's entire field exercise. She corrected it with a thin pen, checking against her schedule. Briggs noticed and snorted. "There it is," he whispered to his friend. "Another mistake from the librarian." More chuckles. Someone behind him added something about mixing up storybooks again. Emily didn't react. She simply placed the folder down and moved on. When she finished, she stepped to the back wall, her usual place, half invisible. Captain Rhodes heard the laughter, but stayed silent. A moment of discomfort wasn't worth defending her. Emily double-checked the schedule and froze. Bravo's training departure time was misaligned. 30 minutes off Alpha's. A tiny clerical error that could break the whole synchronized drill. She walked to Rhodes. "Sir," she said quietly, "Bravo's time is wrong. It should be 10 minutes after Alpha, not 30. He skimmed the page. His jaw tightened. Not because she was wrong, but because she was right. Whispers spread across the first rows. "Look, Wikipedia's fixing our schedule again." Maybe she thinks we can complete missions with sticky notes. Emily lifted the official schedule sheet and held it beside the incorrect one. Rhodes compared them, defeat in his eyes. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll handle it." His reluctance fueled the room. The laughter returned, louder this time. Emily folded her hands and waited, face blank. When the briefing ended, the stampede began. One candidate nearly knocked her over rushing out. Another brushed her shoulder. Scattering papers, didn't even look back. The door slammed shut. Silence followed. Emily gathered the papers, stacked them neatly, and walked out. Everything seemed normal. But inside, beneath the steady breathing and rustle of folders, something shifted. Not anger, not the urge to reveal her past, just a quiet exhaustion, a weight built from years of being unseen, and a certainty, truth, has a way of surfacing, whether people want it to or not. The next morning she came even earlier. The library was dim, faint strips of light slipping through the blinds. Emily pushed her cart between the shelves, arranging new materials. In the doorway appeared Lieutenant Colonel Harris, the Marine Corps historian whose lectures scared even senior officers. But now he spoke gently. "Good morning, Miss Ward." "Good morning, sir." Updated archives are on the center table. A candidate entering behind him almost tripped. Seeing the intimidating historian speak to just the librarian with respect threw him off. He wandered toward a display with an old rifle, trying to mirror a pose from a vintage photograph. Emily glanced at him, noticed his grip was wrong. Without thinking, she said, "Support hand further forward, right under the balance point." He adjusted. The rifle steadied instantly. "Huh. That's a lot better," he muttered. Emily nodded and walked on. He watched her, confused. How did she know that? Later that day, while retrieving an old mission journal, she opened a page where a faded line sat above a list of names. Call sign, Shadow 9. Her fingers paused. Her eyes darkened for a moment. Then she closed the book calmly and slid it back. Even breathing. Even footsteps. No one noticed. That afternoon, water survival training was underway. Candidates in full gear plunged into the deep pool, practicing underwater gear release. Emily came only to deliver updated safety protocols. As she walked along the edge, careful to avoid puddles, Candidate Morrison hit the water wrong. His vest twisted, straps locked. He surfaced once, choking, then went under again. Someone yelled, but instructors were distracted repairing equipment. Emily didn't hesitate. She set the folders down, kicked off her shoes, and dove. Not like a civilian. Not like someone who swims once a year. Her dive was controlled, sharp, military. Within seconds, she was under Morrison, flipping him, ripping the locked strap, pulling him upward. She guided him across the water with precise rescue kicks, shouting, "Keep his head high! Match his breathing, slow it down!" Morrison choked, coughed out water, staring at her. "You're the librarian." Emily gave the smallest smile. "Everyone has their own chapter, recruit." She stepped out of the pool. Water dripped from her clothes. Her folders were damp, but her face was calm. Silence spread across the unit. Then whispers. That wasn't beginner stuff. She moved like a rescue specialist. Who the hell is she? The questions hung in the air. Soon, a man who knew her real past would arrive. A man who knew she was not Emily Ward, the librarian. Commander Nate Gardner's office held that same disciplined silence. Everyone on base treated almost like a sacred rule. Flag on the wall. Framed photos of past graduating classes. An old, slightly faded SEAL team emblem from before the wars, in glass. Gardner stood by the window, a steel mug of long, cold coffee in his hand. He watched the inner yard of the base, where dark, wet patches on the concrete still marked the earlier pool training. "Let me get this straight," he said without turning around. "You're telling me she jumped in herself?" Captain Rhodes stood in front of the desk, feeling smaller than his rank suggested. Uniform perfect, posture ironed by years of service. But there was a slight tremor in his voice. "Yes, sir. I was on the far side, checking the hoist. While we were fixing it, she already had Morrison out." Gardner finally turned away from the window and set the mug down. "And this was done by, as you once called her, the administrative librarian." Rhodes clenched his jaw. His own words, once thrown out as a joke, now sounded painfully stupid. "Honestly, sir, I didn't think she could even swim." Gardner let out a low sound, not a laugh. "Half this base thinks they swim better than the entire fleet," he said, "right up until the day the water stops playing by their rules." He sat down, opened his laptop, and clicked through several internal reports. "How's Morrison?" "Doc says he'll walk away with a scare. A few scrapes." Swallowed some water. "Without her?" Rhodes didn't finish. "You know what I mean, sir." Gardner didn't reply, but his jaw tightened. "Fine. Do the candidates know anything yet?" "Oh, they do, sir. The barracks are buzzing. Half of them are joking the librarian gave a survival lesson. The other half says it was just dumb luck." Gardner swore under his breath and turned back to the screen. "Luck," he repeated quietly. "That's what people call it when they don't want to admit they've been blind." He typed something, dug deeper, opening files protected a lot tighter than anything meant for administrative personnel. Rhodes, not noticing, kept talking. "I ordered an official mention in the daily report. We'll thank her properly in writing." "That's not enough," Gardner cut in, "especially after you let your boys crack jokes at her expense." Rhodes flinched. "Sir, it was just..." "Just?" The commander's eyes went cold. On this base, I don't tolerate the word just when we're talking about people who keep my candidates alive. Rhodes shut his mouth. Silence took the room again. Only the faint hum of the AC filled it. Finally, Gardner closed the document window and looked at him. Bring her here, officially, to reconcile the paperwork after the pool incident. Unofficially. His gaze sharpened. I want to look her in the eye. When someone knocked on the library door, Emily was deep in the archives, hunting one specific report. Her fingers moved along the folder spines, like she knew each one by touch. Come in, she said, not looking up. The door opened with that controlled, careful creak she'd learned to recognize. Not a recruit storming in. An officer who remembers discipline and is a little nervous. Miss Ward, the commander wants to see you, Captain Rhodes said, to go over the pool incident reports. Emily gently placed the folder on her desk, checked that the bookmark was still in place, and only to D turned around. Of course, sir, she answered. I have the dates, report numbers, and attendance list with me. Rhodes held her gaze a little longer than usual. He wanted to say something like, thank you, or I was wrong, but the word stuck. Good, he managed. Let's go. The commander's office met them with cool air and the soft whir of the computer. Gardner was already seated, scrolling through files. When they entered, he looked first at Emily, then at Rhodes. Have a seat, Miss Ward, he said, gesturing to the chair. She sat calmly, straight-backed, the folder resting on her knees. Rhodes stayed standing to the side, as protocol demanded. I read the preliminary report, Gardner began. Because of you, one of my candidates did not drown in the pool today. I just happened to be there, sir, she replied, without false modesty. And I knew what to do. The commander tilted his head slightly. That knew what to do is exactly what I want to talk about. He unfolded a printed document, studied it for a few seconds, then slid it closer. You didn't just jump in, he said. You entered from the calmest line, turned him against the current and freed the straps with the exact movement we teach combat rescue teams. That's not something you pick up at a basic first aid course, Miss Ward. Her eyes dropped for a second to his hands, holding the paper. Then she met his gaze again. There are things, sir, she said quietly, that once you learn, you don't forget. A chill crawled up Rhodes's spine. There was no challenge in her voice. Just a simple fact. Gardner was silent a moment, then reached into his drawer and pulled out another folder. Older, worn at the corners, as if it had followed him through dozens of postings. He opened it, took out a few yellowed sheets, and placed one on top. I don't shock easily, Miss Ward, he said, but today you managed. So I decided to see who exactly I've got working under my nose. He turned the sheet so she could see it. At the top, above a long list of operations, it read, Lieutenant Emily Ward Unit, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, call sign Shadow 9. Rhodes almost lost his balance. It took him several seconds to accept he was reading it for real and not imagining it. Emily didn't flinch. She only exhaled a little slower. I thought those files were sealed, sir, she said softly. For most they are, Gardner nodded. But when someone saves one of my candidates, I earn the right to know who I've actually got on payroll, especially if that someone used to be in DevGru. Rhodes felt ashamed to even breathe. Every joke, every smirk, every just the librarian collapsed into something ugly in his head. Why did you stay quiet about this? The commander asked. Why take a civilian archivist position and act like you've never held a weapon? Emily glanced toward the window, where late afternoon wind was stirring above the base. Then she looked back at him. Because I didn't come here to prove who I am, sir, she answered. I came to make sure the work gets done right. That names don't get lost in the archives. That the young ones can see more than their reflection in the mirror. She paused. And my past belongs to those who didn't come back. Gardner listened to every word. In his eyes, that deep weight appeared, the look of someone who has stood on the line between a formal order and a final breath. You know what angers me most, he asked quietly. How my people treated you. They're young, sir, Emily answered calmly. They think strength is only measured in weight on the bar and time on the obstacle course. I once thought the same. She gave the faintest hint of a smile. Not at herself, not at them, but toward some distant version of her life. You are not released from the duty to carry your experience, Miss Ward, Gardner said slowly. You can hide it from yourself, not from those whose lives it might save one day. He turned to Rhodes. Captain, for the next 2 weeks you personally make sure every candidate passes through this library and attends a course on historical special operations. The lecturer will be Miss Ward. Rhodes' eyebrows shot up. Sir? You heard me. She knows these stories from more than manuals. Gardner looked at Emily again. If she agrees. Something heavy rose in Emily's chest. Lectures. Speaking out loud again about things she had buried for years. If the candidates truly need this, I'll do it, sir, she said at last. They do, he replied. And not just them. He closed the old dossier and slipped it gently back into the drawer. Officially, he added, I'll commend you in the report unofficially. His gaze paused at her shoulder, where other patches once sat. The Bravo unit needs to know who they owe one living candidate to. Rhodes finally pulled himself together. Miss Ward, Emily, The words stuck again, but this time he forced them out. I was wrong. About you. About all of this. She just nodded. Mistakes are part of training too, Captain, she said. What matters is what you do after you've seen them. The commander's lips curled in a faint smile. Well said, Shadow 9. The call sign seemed to thicken the air in the room. Rhodes didn't understand half of what stood behind it. But even that half was enough to push his respect for just the librarian to a level he didn't yet know how to reach. That evening, Emily stayed in the library longer than usual. It was already dark outside, corridors empty. Only her lamp threw a warm circle of light onto the desk, over open archive folders. She pulled out a small black box she hadn't opened in a long time. Inside, an old patch with a pair of wings and the number 9. A small metal tag engraved with Shadow. A few photos taken from a helicopter somewhere over the ocean. Emily studied them for a long moment, as if weighing whether she had the right to let that life back in. Then she carefully put everything away again. But this time left the box on the edge of the desk instead of hiding it deep in the cabinet. Tomorrow, she would have to stand in front of young, loud, overconfident candidates and talk about things she sometimes struggled to describe, even to a therapist. She wasn't sure she was ready. But she knew one thing. Hiding was no longer an option. The commander had seen more than her cardigan and folders, which meant soon others would too. Somewhere far off in the corridor, footsteps echoed. Someone was running toward the barracks, laughing, joking. Just another evening on base. Emily switched off the lamp, looked one last time at the dark outline of the shelves, and said quietly to herself, All right then. If you want the stories, you're going to hear them all the way through. She closed the door and walked down the corridor as calmly as always. Only now there was something new in her step. Not the shadow of someone hiding in the archives, but the quiet certainty of a person stepping back into the game on her own terms. Morning on the base began, as always, with alarm clocks screaming, metal bunks creaking, and the fast stomp of boots on the concrete floors of the barracks. For the candidates, it was just another day to grind through. A run, exercises, cold water, instructors yelling. For Emily, it was the first day she would have to stop hiding behind the shelves. She came to the classroom half an hour before start time. As usual, she checked the projector, the laptop, the microphone. On the board, someone had already written the dry words, Historical Operations of Special Forces Units. Lecturer, Emily Ward. No rank, no position. That's how they always formatted it for civilian staff. She stood there for a moment, looking at the text, then quietly wiped it off with the eraser. After that, she carefully wrote a new version. Emily Ward, former naval. Special Warfare Operator, call sign, Shadow 9. The chalk trembled slightly in her hand, but when she stepped back and looked from the side, she felt a strange lightness, like a heavy stone that had pressed on her chest for years, had finally agreed to move, even just a little. The door clicked. A tech walked in to check the equipment one last time. He glanced at the board, and his eyes almost popped out. "Excuse me, Miss Ward, is that about you?" "Today, yes," she replied calmly. "Don't worry, it's not classified." The tech nodded, but he walked out different, as if he'd just realized this wasn't the librarian's room, but something a lot more important. Emily felt these small changes in people's eyes almost physically. The candidates stormed into the classroom like a noisy wave. Some stretched their necks, trying to see who would be giving the lecture. Others, noticing Emily at the lectern, visibly grimaced with disappointment. Seriously, instead of real tactics, we're getting a lesson on how to label folders. Maybe this is a course on how not to lose a book in the library, another snickered. A few of the guys who had seen her pull Morrison out of the water yesterday stayed quiet. In their faces there was something between shame and curiosity. When they finally sat down, the door closed, and the hum of the AC drowned out the background noise from the bass. Emily stepped forward. She wasn't wearing the cardigan she liked to wear in the library. Instead, she had on a simple, dark blue shirt tucked into her pants. On her chest, a small, almost invisible pin in the shape of a trident and wings. The same one she'd been given long ago, on another base, under a different sky. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was even, unhurried. "My name is Emily Ward. Most of you know me as the person who keeps asking you not to drink coffee over the old logs in the library." A few nervous smiles flickered through the room. "But a long time ago," she continued, "people rarely called me by my name." She tapped lightly on the writing on the board. Usually they just said Shadow 9. The room grew noticeably quieter. Even those who'd been scrolling their phones a minute earlier now lifted their eyes. "Today, I'm not going to teach you how to fill out reports correctly," Emily said. "I'm going to show you what mistakes look like when you pay for them in lives, and what respect looks like when it comes too late." She pressed the remote. A black and white photo appeared on the screen. A young woman in a wet wetsuit, standing beside 4 men, all with exhausted but smiling faces. On the helicopter behind them, a wolf was painted, biting into a wave. "This is one of my first operations," she said. "Now let's be honest. Raise your hand if you thought that in special operations units women sit at computers at best." A few hands went up, reluctant. A few more, with a shrug, as if it didn't matter. "Good," Emily nodded. "Then we'll start from zero." She didn't speak like a lecturer. She spoke like someone who had been silent for a very long time and was finally allowing herself to talk. No pomp, no heroic posing, but no self-pity either. She talked about her first night jump when the ocean looked like a solid black abyss. About the guy on their team who always joked that in a library the scariest thing is an overdue slip, and then got lost in the sand 5 meters from cover. About how easy it is to belittle those who didn't pass selection, and how painful it is later to see their names on casualty lists from regular units. The candidates listened. Some took notes. Some sat with arms crossed, but never took their eyes off the screen. In every operation, there are people no one notices, Emily said, clicking to the next slide. Techs, radio operators, analysts, those bookworms who compile your target dossiers. And if you think they're lower tier, you're not ready to call yourselves a team. In the back rows, a few heads turned. Some recognized themselves in her words. Others recognized their own arrogance from the last few days. Yesterday, one of you almost drowned, Emily went on. She didn't raise her voice, but the room grew especially quiet again. And I saw others standing at the edge, frozen, thinking the instructor would fix everything. She set her hands on the edge of the lectern and leaned in slightly. Remember this. Sometimes no one comes. Not the instructor, not the commander, not a convenient plot twist. Either you move or someone dies. In the front row, Morrison, the same guy who'd swallowed half the pool yesterday, swallowed hard and gave the slightest nod. And, yes, she added, the people you think of as just librarians or just cooks might be the only ones who know what to do, because once they already had to. An hour and a half passed without anyone noticing. At the end, Emily closed the laptop and walked to the board. That's it for today, she said. Next, you've got the obstacle course and another pool session. Someone groaned quietly at the mention of water. But before you go, she paused, I want you to understand one thing. She erased part of the writing on the board, leaving only Shadow 9, and beneath it, in big letters, wrote, Everyone on this base is part of the operation. If you keep laughing at anyone on this base just because they're not wearing the same uniform as you, it means you didn't listen. And it means that sooner or later someone next to you is going to hurt. A lot. She stepped to the side. Questions? The room stayed silent. Usually, after general lectures, someone always asked, Is there going to be a test or can we leave early? This time, no one dared. Finally, Morrison raised his hand. Miss Ward, he hesitated. Emily, why did you leave the unit at all? The projector's cooling fan suddenly became the loudest sound in the room. Emily exhaled slowly. Because once I made a decision that cost someone dearly, she said. Not because I did something clearly wrong, but because I didn't do something I could have done. She didn't go into details. Not now, not here. And I promised myself, if I ever see others repeating my mistake, I'll stop them earlier, even if it means taking off my cardigan and writing my call sign on the board. A faint smile touched her lips. That's all. Dismissed. The candidates stood up. They walked out slower than they'd come in. No shoving, no joking across the aisles. Each one, passing the lectern, glanced at the small black box lying next to her laptop. No one knew what was inside, but everyone, somehow, felt they had no right to touch it. After the lecture, Emily stepped outside to catch her breath. The sun was already high, the air full of salt and the smell of wet concrete. She sat on a bench near the training ground, where she'd once done the same pull-ups these rookies were doing now. Only back then, everything looked different, and she was different too. You did well, a familiar voice said behind her. She turned. Commander Gardner was standing there, arms crossed, watching the candidates run their laps. They listened, Emily replied. That's already something. They didn't just listen. Some of them were actually thinking for the first time in a while, he said dryly. I saw their faces from the window. He sat beside her, leaving a bit of space, not from coldness, but out of respect. You know what's funny, the commander went on. When I told them you'd be teaching this course, 2 instructors quietly came to me and asked, Does she really know the material? She's just our paperwork lady. Emily smiled faintly. And what did you say? I said if they want to question it, they can bring me their operation reports for the last 10 years and lay them next to yours. He shrugged. For some reason, no one showed up. They watched in silence for a few seconds as the guys ran from station to station. Are you planning to change your status? Gardner asked suddenly. Come back on the books, officially. Emily looked out toward the sea, thoughtful. I'm not sure my bones would be thrilled about night marches anymore, sir, she said. And someone still needs to keep your reports from turning into chaos. So you're staying a librarian? I'm staying what I was yesterday, she answered. Only now some people know a bit more. The commander nodded. Fine. But know this. If you ever want to come back, the door isn't closed. Sometimes units need people who already know how to walk in the shadows. She glanced at his profile. Sharp, tired, and realized he was speaking not just as a commander, but as someone who had once stood at the same crossroads. Come back, or walk away. I'll remember that, sir, she said quietly. The pool incident didn't end with one lecture. News that the librarian used to be DevGru spread through the base faster than any rumor about new standards. In the mess hall, there was no more whispering behind her back. If anyone whispered now, it definitely wasn't about, what the hell is she even doing here? Several times, candidates came up to her in the library on their own. Miss Ward, can I borrow those materials on Operation Torch you mentioned? You said you have pilots' diaries from the teams that worked with maritime groups. Can I see them? Is it true some operators slept 2 hours a day for weeks on certain ops? How did you handle it? She answered without brushing them off. Showed them books, reports, sometimes even her old notes, where long ago, in green ballpoint pen, she had underlined phrases like, "Don't devalue support. Check every name on the list twice." Once even that same tech who'd checked her projector came by. Miss Ward, could you maybe look over our backup power schematics? He asked awkwardly. After your lecture, I realized that if we mess something up, people can get hurt because of us too. Emily felt something warm unfold inside, like someone had finally opened a long-shut window. But not everyone accepted the new reality the same way. There were those who whispered, "It's just for show. If she was that good, she'd still be serving. Command just wants to motivate us with fairy tales." Instructor Thomas, the same one who'd once wondered aloud if librarian wasn't too fancy a title, was quieter now, but sometimes that familiar skepticism still flashed in his eyes. One day, after the obstacle course, when the candidates were scattering across the yard, he walked over to Emily, who was watching from the shade. "Nice audience you've got there," he said. "They almost made you a goddess after one jump into a pool." Emily didn't even turn her head at first. "If you'd like to discuss how many jumps I had before that," she said evenly. "Your commander has access to the logs." "Oh, I'm sure he does," Thomas shrugged. "But you know what I see? They're looking for another legend. Someone to save them. Not a reason to act on their own." Emily finally turned to him. "You're afraid they'll start waiting for a magic librarian instead of jumping in themselves?" Thomas was slightly surprised she'd voiced his thought so bluntly. "Exactly," he nodded. "We're here to make them into people who don't need saving every 5 minutes." "And that," Emily said, "means we're on the same side. Because if you noticed, my whole lecture was about the fact that no one is coming." She paused, then added, "But there is a difference between knowing no one is coming and thinking you're alone in the world and therefore have the right to look down on those who quietly do their work." Thomas opened his mouth to argue, then just exhaled instead. "You're good at putting in full stops, Miss Ward." "Occupational habit," she smiled slightly, "and also from my past." They stood there a while longer, watching Morrison and a few others practicing water entries and exits at the pool on their own, without an instructor's order. The water splashed, but in their eyes now, there wasn't just the urge to show off. There was focus. "See," Emily said quietly. "They're not waiting to be pulled out anymore. They're learning how not to go under." Thomas nodded, reluctantly, but sincerely. "Maybe I really was wrong about you, Shadow 9, he said. She didn't answer, but in her smile there was something he hadn't noticed before. Not pride, not resentment. A calmness of someone who no longer has to prove anything, except her own honesty. That evening, Emily, as always, was the last to return to the library. She'd gotten used to the doors being held open for her with a bit more respect now, but she still felt like the same woman who loved books and order in the files. She turned on the soft light, walked between the rows, straightening leaning spines, the way someone else might straighten collars before a formation. There was a small note waiting for her on the desk. A square scrap of paper torn from a notebook, the lines uneven. "Miss Ward, thank you for today. I thought this place ran on yelling and strength only. Now I see it also runs on people nobody notices." Morrison. Next to it lay his training tag, the plastic one they wore during simulations. Not a real dog tag, but right now it meant more to him than anything he'd done on base so far. Emily picked up the tag, squeezed it in her fist, and smiled softly. "All right, Jake," she whispered. "Looks like you're starting to understand." She placed the tag into the same black box where her old badges and call sign lay. Now it wasn't just a container for the past. It was a small bridge between who she had been and who they were becoming. Ahead lay more lectures, more conversations, more late hours in the archives. Ahead was a day when one of these guys or girls might come back after a real operation and say, "Miss Ward, remember when you told us about—" She didn't know what stories they would bring back, but she was ready now to meet them, not as a shadow in the corner, but as someone who had once already come back from the dark and knew the value of a quiet voice from the back of the room. She turned off the lights, locked the door, and walked down the corridor, where all the day's noise had already died away. In the silence, you could hear only the distant sound of the ocean and the measured footsteps of the night patrol. Shadow 9 was no longer hiding. She simply walked her routes, between shelves, offices, and training grounds, and every day changed the base a little, even if most people never noticed, because that's exactly how people work who are used to operating in the shadows. The base was getting ready for an important day, not for drills, not for a fitness test, for something everyone hated in their own way. A high command inspection. Extra folders were being carried down the corridors. Even the handrails no one ever touched were being wiped down. Instructors walked around more tense than usual. Candidates were getting chewed out even for a slightly crooked, "Yes, sir." Emily knew this state very well. She'd seen it back when she'd stood in formation herself and not between the shelves. Back then, they hid the pressure behind dark humor. Now, it was hidden behind extra paperwork and perfectly sterile desks. This visit was different. The base was expecting Vice Admiral Reed, a man who was a legend in the Navy. Stories about him said he could take one look at a unit and instantly tell who was a real operator and who just wore the uniform well. Emily had no intention of crossing his path. Her day was simple. Keep the archive in order, help with the inspection documents, make sure the instructors didn't mix up real reports, and parade versions at the last second. "Miss Ward, we need all incident reports from training mishaps over the last 2 years, one officer asked. "And separately, all cases of disciplinary violations among the candidates," added another. She no longer felt annoyed by this avalanche. On the contrary, every signature, every date, every line. It was structure. And where there is order, It's always easier to find the truth. He appeared closer to noon. No fanfare. No parade formation. Just with a small group of officers around him who all somehow wanted to sink into his shadow, and at the same time stand close enough to be in his line of sight. Vice Admiral Reed looked nothing like his photos in the hallway. A bit shorter, a bit grayer, the same hard facial features. But in his eyes there was far more fatigue than on any glossy portrait. He inspected the parade ground, the training areas, the pool. Instructors demonstrated crisp commands. Candidates ran as if their life depended on it. And in a way it did. This base didn't understand half measures. When they reached the administrative wing, Gardner gave a subtle nod toward the library. "Sir, this is our Learning and Information Center. Literature, archives?" "The library," Reed clarified briefly. "Good. Let's have a look." Emily was sorting reports by date when the door opened sharply, and too loudly. The way people who like to feel their weight in a room always open doors. "All training evacuation reports for the last 5 years," barked one of the accompanying officers, a major with a cold stare. "And make it quick. We don't have time for your filing system." He didn't even look up at her, just examined the wall behind Emily as if he expected to see medals there that actually interested him. "They're already prepared," she said calmly. "Right here, sorted by year with flags on the real incidents." She handed him a perfectly organized stack. The major took it, glanced in surprise at the labeled dividers, but said nothing. Behind him, Reed appeared in the doorway. He walked in slowly, as if listening to the air itself. He scanned the room. Shelves, catalogs, computers. A small table where candidates worked. His gaze stopped on the small pin on Emily's chest, the one with the trident and wings. "You're Miss Ward?" he asked, not like an inspector, but like a man verifying something in his own memory. "Yes, sir," she replied evenly. "Librarian, responsible for archives, literature, and part of the training programs." "I've been told you keep this place in exemplary order," Reed nodded. "But paperwork is the last thing I care about." He stepped closer and noticed the writing on a small board by the desk, where Emily sometimes left notes for the candidates. "Don't confuse history with legend. Both hold truth, but at a different price." The corner of his mouth twitched slightly. "Whose quote is that?" "Mine, sir," she answered honestly. He studied her, holding her gaze longer than etiquette usually allowed. "Tell me, Miss Ward," his voice grew quieter but harder, "how many people on this base know you didn't wear that pin as decoration?" The major tensed behind him, looking from Emily to Reed. She felt an old shadow stir under her ribs again, not fear, just the fact that the past had once more opened a door without knocking. "A few, sir," she answered. "Command staff, some instructors. A couple of candidates figured it out after a recent pool incident." "And you don't think hiding your experience from people who risk their lives every day is a luxury?" Reed tilted his head slightly. "Or was that your condition when you agreed to work here as a civilian?" The major sighed, clearly feeling the conversation leave the safe track of a standard inspection. Emily held the vice admiral's eyes. "I didn't hide it, sir. I just didn't advertise it. If someone asked, I answered. If not, I gave them a chance to judge me by the work I do now, not by what's typed in old mission logs." Reed was silent for a few seconds. Something like respect, mixed with irritation, flickered in his eyes. "Did you serve directly under Admiral Grayson?" he suddenly asked. "Yes, sir," she answered briefly. "Pacific Base." "Then I'm not surprised," Reed muttered to himself. He always knew how to pick those who don't waste words. The major was clearly losing the thread of the conversation. "Sir, we still need to go over the safety protocol checklist." "We will," Reed cut him off. "But First, I want to hear one thing from Miss Ward. He turned back to Emily. How do you assess these candidates? Not in terms of fitness or standards, in terms of whether one day we can trust them with the lives of the people who trust us now. It was one of the most serious questions you could ask someone who'd once stood in the line herself. Far more serious than any, are we compliant with regulations? Emily didn't rush her answer. She remembered Morrison's face above the water, the panic in the boy's eyes on the pool edge, their silence during her lecture, their questions in the library, the note with the tag. They're not ready yet, she said finally, but they have something that gives them a chance. What exactly? Reed didn't look away. They're starting to see other people, not just themselves in the mirror and not just officers on a podium. They're noticing techs, medics, cooks, librarians. They're beginning to tie their discipline to those people's safety, not just to their own careers. She paused. And where that kind of respect appears, there's a chance that one day they'll make the right decision when no one is standing next to them. Tired crow's feet appeared at the corners of Reed's eyes. They could have been read as the hint of a smile. Interesting assessment, he said, coming from someone most of them still think of as just a librarian. Sometimes a shadow sees the light better than a spotlight, Emily replied quietly. Reed inclined his head. Good. I'll take your opinion into account, Miss Ward. He was already turning toward the door when the major, who'd been bouncing between confusion and annoyance this whole time, couldn't hold back. Sir, if I may, we do have appointed officers to assess readiness. Is it really appropriate to rely this much on a civilian specialist? Reed stopped, turned back toward him so slowly that the room seemed to get colder for a moment. Major, he said calmly, how many real combat operations do you have under your belt? The major straightened. 3, sir. Afghanistan and Iraq. And Miss Ward, Reed nodded toward Emily, has several dozen, most of which you will never read about, even in classified reports. So next time, before you question the weight of her words, think about how many people are alive because those words once weren't spoken out loud by her. The major sucked in a breath. Yes, sir, he managed. Emily felt something strange and twofold. On the one hand, support. On the other, the unpleasant exposure of something she'd spent decades keeping sealed. For a few more hours after the inspection, a nervous hum walked the base. Vice Admiral Reed held a meeting with the officers, took another look at the training grounds, talked to the medics. Everyone tried to understand. Did we pass? Or is this going to hurt? Evening found Emily in the library. Where else? She was going through old catalogs when someone knocked on the door, hesitant. It's open, she called. Morrison stood in the doorway. Behind him, 2 more candidates. They looked like they'd just come from a room where they'd been shown videos that change how you see life. Miss Ward, Morrison started, embarrassed. They told us, the commander mentioned that you. I know what he might have said, she replied calmly. Come in already. They sat down at the table, not daring to look her in the eye right away. Finally, one of the guys, the same one who used to laugh about the bookworm, managed to choke out, Is it true your call sign was Shadow 9? Yes, she nodded. And that you worked with those... He couldn't find the word, but everyone understood. Yes, Emily confirmed. Silence fell. The kind of silence that used to be filled with dumb, that's awesome. Whoa! But now held something different. A slow rewiring of their assumptions. Why didn't you tell us? Morrison asked quietly. Emily looked him straight in the eye. Because you needed to learn to see a person first, and only then a legend. Otherwise, you'll spend your whole life looking for heroes to save you from your own decisions. She paused. You've already seen that no one ran into the water for you. But someone jumped. Now the important thing is that next time you jump, without waiting for legends. The boys were silent. They say the real lessons on a base aren't in the manuals, but in short phrases that echo in your head for years, on night marches and in those quiet, too quiet pauses in combat. Miss Ward, one of the candidates, said hesitantly, If we ever, you know. He tripped over his words, but she understood. If one day you're scared, she suggested gently, and you want to remember something that doesn't sound like a recruitment poster? They laughed quietly, but there was more relief than mockery in their laughter. Then come here, Emily said. There are stories about people like you, and people like those you want to become, and a few stories about those who were sure they'd never break, and did. You can learn a lot from them, too. She stood, walked over to one of the shelves, and pulled out an old folder without a glossy cover. Start with this. No pictures, no hype, just real reports, real names, and real mistakes. They took the folder as carefully as if it were a weapon. Thank you, Miss Ward, Morrison said. And one more thing, she added as they reached the door. If I hear anyone on this base call someone a parasite, just support staff, or some civilian again, you and I are going to have a very serious conversation. And trust me, you don't want to be on the receiving end of that conversation. They all nodded at once, not even trying to joke it off. A few days later, Reed left. The official inspection report was dry. The base meets standards. It is recommended to strengthen integration programs between combat units and support personnel. Commend the work of the library and information section. No one threw a party. On bases like this, they don't celebrate not getting written up. But something had changed. In the mess hall, you could occasionally hear, Hey, careful with that tray. The med guys are standing there. Ask the tech. He knows better how that should be wired. I'll go to the library. Miss Ward has some material on our topic. No loud slogans, just small but important turns in everyday phrases. Emily did the same work as before, sorting, searching, filing, correcting, explaining. Only now, when she walked down the corridor, some of the candidates subconsciously straightened up. Not the way they did when a general walked past. Differently, like in front of someone whose words had already touched something deeper than fear of a bad report. One evening, as the base was getting ready for another night training phase, Commander Gardner came by. I've got news for you, he said, sitting on the edge of her desk. A new training module has been officially approved. Which one? Emily asked. History of Special Operations and the Role of the Invisible Links. 2 weeks. Mandatory for everyone. He handed her a folder. Course author, you. Instructor, also you. If you agree, Shadow 9. She looked at the folder and felt fear, responsibility, lightness, and something very close to quiet pride mix in her chest. I agree, sir, she said, but on one condition. Which is? My call sign doesn't go on the cover, just my name, and the words, former operator. Let them see the rest on their own. Gardner smiled. You're as stubborn as ever. That's why I'm still alive, Emily joked. That night she couldn't fall asleep for a long time. She sat by the window at home, listening to the distant rumble of aircraft and the soft hiss of the coffee machine. Her eyes kept returning to the black box on the table. Inside were her old tags, badges, the small pin, a few photos, and Morrison's training tag. Emily opened the box and took out one of the old dog tags, ran her fingers over the cold metal, over the name engraved there, the same name she had now, but as if it belonged to a different person. You really thought you could hide forever, didn't you? She said quietly to herself. In response, only silence and the faint hum of the bass somewhere in the distance. She put the tag back, but didn't close the box. Let it stay open. A reminder that sometimes shadows have to step into the light. There would still be people on the base who looked down on others. There would still be those who forgot her lessons. There would be new candidates who would first see just a woman at a desk. But every time someone walked out of the library carrying a folder of dry reports and a bit less arrogance in their head, every time an instructor thought twice before yelling at a tech, every time a future operator in a real operation turned around and said, "Let's check again, make sure we didn't leave anyone behind," a piece of that decision would be hers too. The woman who had willingly hidden among the shelves, but remembered in time that her mission wasn't just to file the past, it was to shape the future. Shadow 9, Emily Ward, the librarian from the Special Operations Base. They would say those names many times, in many different ways. Some with respect, some with a smile, some with nostalgia. But one thing they would never say again was, "She's just someone from support." Because on this base, after that water, that lecture, and that inspection, all the quiet shadows had finally earned the right to their own light. And that was perhaps the most important operation Shadow 9 had ever carried out in her life.